The universe is a violent place, filled with predators that would snap a human spine like a dry twig. When the apex terror of Sector 4 finally fell, bleeding and cornered, it didn't need our guns. It needed our humanity. This is the classified truth of the Kepler incident. To understand the tragedy and the subsequent miracle of Outpost Delta, 9, you have to understand the sheer, unforgiving hostility of the planet Kepler, 186F. We didn't belong there. The atmosphere was a toxic soup of nitrogen and methane, the gravity was just heavy enough to make your joints ache by midday, and the native flora possessed defensive neurotoxins that could paralyze a grown man in seconds. But beneath the crust of the region designated as the Obsidian Wastes, the United Earth Mining Corporation had discovered vast veins of refined promethium. And where there is energy, there is human greed. Dr. Nathaniel George never cared much for the promethium. A 50-year-old xenobiologist who had cut his teeth studying silicon-based microbes on Mars and deep-sea extremophiles in the Mariana Trench, Nathaniel was sent to Kepler to rubber stamp the UEMC's environmental impact reports. He was a quiet man, carrying the heavy, invisible grief of a widower who had also lost his only daughter, Lily, to a sudden autoimmune failure back in Boston 3 years prior. The void of space was a convenient place to hide from the ghosts of a quiet, empty house. For the first 6 months, the mining operation ran smoothly. The Lockheed Martin atmospheric scrubbers hummed continuously, creating a breathable bubble for the 300 engineers, miners, and private military contractors stationed at the outpost. But then, the deep-core drilling teams breached the lower mantle of Sector 4. They woke something up. The initial reports were dismissed as equipment failure, a localized seismic anomaly, followed by the complete loss of telemetry from Drilling Team Alpha. When Commander David Reynolds dispatched a heavily armed retrieval squad led by Captain Hayes, the feed that came back to the command center froze the blood of everyone watching. It wasn't a cave-in. It was a massacre. The creature was later classified in the DARPA xenology databases as a Titanus apex, but the terrified miners simply called it the Gorgon. It was a biological nightmare, a localized apex predator that defied standard evolutionary logic. Standing roughly 10 feet tall at the shoulder, its body was encased in a jagged, chitinous armor that deflected standard-issue pulse rifle fire like raindrops. It moved on 6 multi-jointed limbs ending in monomolecular scythes that could shear through a titanium bulkhead. Most terrifying of all were its eyes, a cluster of deep, bioluminescent crimson orbs that tracked movement with terrifying mechanical precision. For 3 weeks, the Gorgon waged a one-beast war against Outpost Delta, 9. It didn't just hunt for food, it hunted with a frightening, systematic intelligence. It targeted the main power conduits, crippling the perimeter defenses. It ambushed patrols, dragging armored soldiers into the darkness of the subterranean tunnels, leaving nothing behind but static on their comms and trails of glowing blue biological residue. Panic set in. The investors back in London and New York demanded the creature be neutralized, refusing to authorize an evacuation that would cost billions in lost revenue. Commander Reynolds, an old-school pragmatist, locked down the base and turned it into a fortress, authorizing the use of heavy incendiary munitions and automated plasma turrets. Nathaniel watched the escalation with a growing sense of dread. He spent hours analyzing the blurry security footage of the creature. Something about its behavior didn't align with a simple territorial predator. "Look at the pacing, David," Nathaniel had argued in the command center, pointing at a frozen holographic display of the beast. "It's not eating the bodies. It's destroying the sonic drill heads and the seismic charges. This isn't predation. It's a desperately targeted defensive maneuver. We dropped a mining rig right on top of its habitat. It's trying to eliminate the source of the noise." Commander Reynolds scoffed, adjusting the heavy Kevlar vest strapped to his chest. "I don't care if we dropped a rig on its favorite armchair, Nathaniel. It has killed 34 of my people. I'm not here to study it. I'm here to exterminate it. The trap is set in the primary loading bay. When it comes for the main reactor, we blow the struts and vent it into the toxic storm outside." Nathaniel wanted to argue, to cite the Johannesburg Treaty of 2145, which explicitly protected highly sapient extraterrestrial life. But he knew it was futile. The men were terrified, grieving, and out for blood. The beast had been reduced to a monster in their eyes, And in the dark reaches of space, fear always overrides science. The climax of this violent clash came on a Tuesday, during a violent methane storm that rattled the very foundations of the outpost. Nathaniel was in the medical wing, cataloging genetic samples, when the primary klaxons began to wail. The lighting shifted to a harsh, strobing red. The mechanical voice of the outpost's AI echoed through the corridors. Warning. Hull breach in Sector 4. Primary loading bay compromised. Containment protocol initiated. Nathaniel grabbed his emergency medical kit and a standard-issue sidearm, a weapon he hadn't fired since basic training, and sprinted down the corridor. He didn't intend to fight, but the loading bay housed the auxiliary oxygen reserves. If the beast destroyed them during its rampage, the entire outpost would suffocate in hours. As he rounded the corner to the observation deck overlooking the loading bay, the blast doors suddenly engaged, slamming shut with a deafening metallic thud. Nathaniel was on the wrong side. He was locked inside the loading bay. And he was not alone. The primary loading bay was a cavernous space, a cathedral of cold gray steel and massive industrial machinery. Cargo crates stacked 3 stories high created a maze of metal canyons. Shadows danced wildly as the emergency backup lights flickered and sparked. Nathaniel pressed his back against a reinforced Durasteel shipping container, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The air was thick with the sharp, acidic scent of ozone and the unmistakable coppery tang of fresh blood. A horrific, high-pitched screech tore through the air, vibrating in Nathaniel's dental fillings. It was followed by the groan of tearing metal and the heavy, earth-shaking thuds of the Gorgon. Over the internal comms, the voice of Captain Hayes crackled, laced with static and adrenaline. "We have it!" It took the bait. "Reynolds, prime the industrial plasma cutters. Do it now before it breaches the inner doors." Nathaniel peeked around the edge of the container. In the center of the bay, the Gorgon was thrashing violently. Up close, the sheer scale of the creature was paralyzing. Its obsidian carapace was slick with a strange oily residue, and its massive sides were tearing chunks of metal out of the reinforced blast doors leading to the reactor room. Suddenly, the ceiling groaned. Commander Reynolds had sprung the trap. 4 massive, automated industrial plasma cutters tools designed to slice through meteorites and heavy starship plating dropped from their concealed overhead housings. They ignited with a blinding sun-white brilliance, their beams converging directly on the beast. The creature shrieked, a sound so agonizing and human-like in its register that Nathaniel flinched, covering his ears. The plasma beams carved into the beast's impenetrable armor. The chitin cracked, popped, and gave way. "Hold the beams! Burn the bastard to ash!" Hayes roared over the comms. But the beast was strong, fueled by a terrifying, desperate adrenaline. With a massive heave of its back legs, it lunged forward, narrowly escaping the focal point of the plasma convergence. It swung one of its scythes upward, severing the power conduit to the ceiling turrets in a shower of brilliant blue sparks. The plasma cutters died, plunging the room back into strobing red darkness. The trap had failed to kill it, but the damage was catastrophic. Nathaniel watched, trembling, as the beast collapsed near the center of the bay. Its left side was a ruined, smoking crater of melted chitin and exposed, pulsing tissue. Thick, bioluminescent azure fluid, its equivalent of blood, pumped rapidly onto the steel floor, pooling in glowing puddles. 2 of its massive legs were severed entirely, twitching uselessly a few feet away. It was mortally wounded. It dragged itself toward the wall, its remaining scythe scraping pitifully against the floor. The terrifying apex predator was reduced to a broken, dragging mess. "Damn it! It took out the cutters!" Reynolds' voice boomed over the bay's loudspeaker. "All units, converge on the loading bay. Prepare to breach the manual airlocks. We finish it with heavy ordnance." Nathaniel remained frozen behind the crate. He looked down at the heavy pistol in his trembling hand. He could end it. He could step out, aim for the exposed glowing flesh of its wound, and be hailed as the hero of Outpost Delta 9. But, as he watched the creature, his trained xenobiologist eye noticed something that froze the blood in his veins. The beast wasn't trying to escape. It had dragged itself into a corner, backing into a tight recess between 2 massive generators. It curled its massive, broken body inward, wrapping its remaining limbs around its own abdomen. It was shivering. Through the heavy mechanical breathing and the hiss of its boiling blood, Nathaniel heard a sound. It was a low, rhythmic keening, a vibrational hum that fluctuated in pitch and tone. It wasn't a roar of anger. It wasn't a threat display. It was a cry of pure, unadulterated terror. Nathaniel slowly lowered his pistol. He remembered the lectures at the Johns Hopkins Xenology Institute. Predators of this magnitude do not exhibit panic responses unless their neural architecture possesses high sapience and deep emotional connectivity. A mindless bug fights until it is dead. A conscious, feeling being mourns its own passing. The beast let out another rattling, high-pitched hum. It was suffocating on the heavy oxygen mix of the base, its internal organs failing. It pressed its massive head against the cold steel of the floor, its multiple crimson eyes dimming, blinking slowly. Nathaniel looked at the beast's back. Tucked beneath a protective ridge of unburned carapace, he saw them. 3 large crystalline ovoids. Eggs, they were fused to the mother's back, connected by a network of glowing, umbilical-like veins. But the plasmablast had caught the edge of the cluster. 2 of the eggs were shattered, leaking a pale, milky substance. The third was intact, pulsing with a faint, frantic heartbeat of blue light. Nathaniel's breath hitched in his throat. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, the missing drill heads, the targeted attacks on the seismic charges, the refusal to eat the miners. She wasn't an apex predator hunting for sport. She was a mother whose subterranean nesting ground had been blown apart by human explosives. She had dragged her surviving eggs to the surface, fighting a desperate, losing war against an alien invasion force that had slaughtered her kind and destroyed her home. And now, she was dying in a cold, metallic box, miles away from the Earth she knew, watching her final child fade. "Breach in 2 minutes," Reynolds commanded over the radio. "Lock and load, gentlemen. No chances." Nathaniel looked at the shattered eggs. Then, unbidden, the memory of a sterile hospital room in Boston flooded his mind. He remembered sitting by a small bed, watching the monitors beep, holding Lily's fragile, cold hand as the machines slowly stopped. He remembered the absolute, crushing helplessness of being unable to save his child. He looked back at the terrifying alien monster. He didn't see a Gorgon, he saw a mirror. Nathaniel George dropped his gun. It clattered loudly against the steel deck. The beast's head snapped up, its dimming red eyes locking onto Nathaniel. It let out a weak, defensive hiss, trying to raise a broken scythe to shield the surviving egg on its back. Nathaniel stepped out from behind the crate, his hands raised, his palms open and empty. "Easy," Nathaniel whispered, his voice trembling but finding a steady rhythm. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." He took a slow step forward. The beast tensed, a low guttural growl vibrating in its throat. The sheer mass of the creature, even broken and dying, was intimidating. The heat radiating from its body and the plasma burns made the air waver. Nathaniel stopped about 10 feet away. He knew that any sudden movement, any aggressive posture, would result in the beast using its last ounce of strength to cleave him in two. He needed to de-escalate. He needed to bridge the communication gap between 2 entirely different evolutionary trees. He noticed the tympanic membranes on the side of the creature's neck, thin, translucent scales that fluttered rapidly. They were highly sensitive auditory receptors, likely evolved to hear the subterranean movements of prey or the calls of their kin through miles of solid rock. Sound. It communicated through complex acoustic vibrations. Nathaniel swallowed hard. The memory of Lily was still fresh, stinging the edges of his eyes. When the pain had been too much for her, when the drugs stopped working and the fear of the dark closed in, words hadn't helped. Only one thing had calmed her. Nathaniel closed his eyes. In the blood-stained, strobing hellscape of the loading bay, the xenobiologist began to sing. His voice was a deep, warm baritone, carrying a quiet strength that echoed off the high metal ceilings. He chose an old Appalachian folk lullaby, a song of weary travels and the promise of rest. "I am a poor, wayfaring stranger." The beast flinched at the first note, its scythe twitching. But Nathaniel didn't stop. He held his ground, keeping his hands visible, pouring every ounce of his own grief, his own empathy into the melody. While traveling through this world of woe. The acoustics of the metal bay caught the song, amplifying the soft, mournful tones. The harsh mechanical noises of the failing outpost seemed to fade into the background. Yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright world to which I go. Something incredible happened. The beast's defensive hiss tapered off. Its massive, armored head tilted slightly, the tympanic membranes on its neck fluttering in perfect rhythm with Nathaniel's vibrato. Nathaniel opened his eyes, taking a slow step closer. He kept singing, transitioning into a softer, humming register, mimicking the low-frequency vibrations he had heard the creature making moments before. He was no longer just singing. He was harmonizing with the dying alien's neural frequency. I'm going there to see my father. I'm going there, no more, to Rome. The beast lowered its broken scythe. The aggressive posture dissolved, replaced by a profound, exhaustion-heavy slump. It realized this tiny, soft creature standing before it was not raising a weapon. It was offering a lament. Nathaniel dropped to his knees in the pool of glowing blue blood, mere inches from the terrifying jaws of the monster. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand. The beast watched him. Its breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps. Slowly, agonizingly, it lowered its massive head until its armored snout rested on the steel deck just inches from Nathaniel's outstretched hand. Nathaniel gently placed his palm against the smooth obsidian armor between the creature's dimming crimson eyes. The chitin was warm, vibrating with a failing pulse. I'm only going over Jordan, Nathaniel sang softly, a tear finally breaking free and tracking through the dirt on his cheek. I'm only going over home. The beast let out a long, shuddering sigh that blew a gust of metallic-smelling air over Nathaniel. Its eyes met his. In that brief, impossible moment of contact, Nathaniel felt a wave of profound, suffocating sorrow wash over him. It wasn't human grief, but it was universally recognizable. It was the desperate love of a parent, the agony of failure, and the terrifying acceptance of the end. The beast closed its eyes. From the corner of its primary ocular cluster, a thick, viscous drop of bioluminescent fluid welled up. It trailed down the creature's armored cheek like a glowing sapphire tear, splashing silently onto the steel floor. The vicious monster of Sector 4, the terror of Kepler, 186F, was weeping. It made one final sound, a soft, low thrum that perfectly mimicked the final two notes of Nathaniel's lullaby. Then the immense weight of the creature settled. The blue light in its veins dimmed, flickered, and finally went out. The mother was dead. Nathaniel knelt there in the silence, his hand still resting on the creature's cold armor, weeping openly for the monster that humanity had created. Suddenly, the heavy blast doors behind him hissed and blew open with a deafening crack. Commander Reynolds and a dozen heavily armed soldiers stormed into the bay, laser sights cutting through the smoke, rifles raised and screaming for Nathaniel to get down. "Hold your fire!" Nathaniel screamed, his voice breaking as he leaped to his feet, placing himself between the soldiers and the massive corpse. He spread his arms wide, shielding the dead mother, shielding the single, surviving, pulsing blue egg still clinging to her back. "Hold your fire! She's gone! It's over!" Reynolds marched forward, his face pale as he surveyed the carnage, the melted beast, and the kneeling, sobbing scientist covered in alien blood. "Good God, Nathaniel," Reynolds breathed, lowering his rifle. "What did you do?" Nathaniel looked back at the beast, the glowing tear still pooling on the floor, and then at the pulse of the surviving egg. "I listened," Nathaniel said quietly. "And now, Commander, we have to fix this." The standoff in the primary loading bay lasted for a grueling 10 minutes. Commander David Reynolds stood with his pulse rifle tightly gripped, his jaw clenched so hard the muscles jumped beneath his skin. The heavy metallic scent of the mother's bioluminescent blood mingled with the acrid smoke of the plasma burns, creating an atmosphere that felt as heavy as lead. "Nathaniel," Reynolds warned, his voice dangerously low, "step away from the carcass. That thing killed 34 of my men. I am not leaving a live spore, egg, or offspring intact to finish the job." Nathaniel George did not move. He kept his body firmly positioned between the smoking remains of the Titanus apex and the barrels of the security team. Behind him, the sole surviving egg pulsed with a frantic, rhythmic azure light. "David, look at it!" Nathaniel pleaded, his voice hoarse from weeping. "It's a localized defense response. She was a mother protecting her nesting grounds. She didn't consume the dead. She targeted the seismic charges. We are the invaders here. If you destroy this egg, you aren't neutralizing a threat. You are committing an act of xenocide against a highly sapient, emotionally capable species." "It's a bug, Nathaniel!" a young corporal yelled from the back of the formation, his hands shaking. "It cut Miller in half." "It wept!" Nathaniel roared back, pointing at the glowing, viscous puddle near the creature's massive snout. The bioluminescent tear was still emitting a faint, sorrowful glow in the dim light of the loading bay. "It sang to me. It understood grief." Reynolds slowly lowered his weapon, motioning for his men to do the same. The commander was a hardened military contractor, but he was not a monster. He looked at the glowing tear, then at the exhausted, broken scientist kneeling in the alien blood. "You have 48 hours, Nathaniel," Reynolds finally grunted, turning his back. "Get that thing out of my loading bay and into level 4 biocontainment. But understand this: United Earth Mining Corporation will not let this go. When the board in Geneva hears about this, they will glass the entire subterranean network." The next 2 days were a frantic, sleep-deprived blur. Nathaniel, alongside a hesitant medical team, carefully excised the surviving egg from the mother's carapace. They transported the heavy, crystalline ovoid to the highest security laboratory in Outpost Delta, 9. But Nathaniel knew that biocontainment wouldn't stop the UEMC. Director Charles Montgomery, the ruthless head of operations stationed in New York, had already sent an encrypted directive demanding the immediate incineration of the biological material and the deployment of thermobaric charges into Sector 4. The company wanted the promethium, and they didn't care who or what they had to exterminate to get it. Nathaniel realized that science and morality would not win a closed-door argument with a trillion-dollar corporation. He needed leverage. He needed the one thing humanity, for all its flaws, could not ignore: a story. Using a bypassed quantum relay terminal, Nathaniel compiled the acoustic telemetry from the loading bay, the biological scans of the creature's neural pathways, and the raw security footage of the mother weeping and harmonizing to his lullaby. He encrypted the package and beamed it directly to Dr. Benjamin Caldwell, a former colleague and prominent exolinguist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, with a simple message: publish it everywhere. The fallout was instantaneous and seismic. Within hours, the audio of the alien mother harmonizing with an Appalachian folk song went viral across Earth's neural net. News outlets in London, Paris, and Washington played the footage on a loop. The public outcry was deafening. Humanity, a species that had long ago wiped out many of its own apex predators, suddenly found itself confronted with the horrifying reality of its own interstellar industrialism. Protests erupted outside the UEMC headquarters in Geneva. The United Nations Outer Space Treaty Committee issued an emergency injunction, stripping UEMC of its lethal autonomy on Kepler 186f. In the span of a week, the Titanus apex was reclassified from a hostile biological hazard to a protected sapient entity. Back on Outpost Delta, 9. Nathaniel sat in the pale, sterile light of the biocontainment lab. Inside a reinforced glass incubator, bathed in the warmth of artificial thermal lamps, the egg began to crack. A sharp chitinous limb punched through the crystalline shell, followed by a series of frantic, high-pitched clicks. Nathaniel stepped closer to the glass, his breath fogging the pain. The infant tumbled out. It was roughly the size of a large dog, its carapace soft and translucent, glowing with a rapid, terrified blue pulse. It possessed the same terrifying anatomy as its mother: 6 multi-jointed limbs, sharp scythes, and a cluster of crimson ocular receptors. But without the massive size, it looked incredibly fragile. It scrambled into the corner of the incubator, shivering violently, letting out a panicked, screeching wail. Nathaniel bypassed the intercom and stepped directly into the containment room. He ignored the frantic warnings flashing on the monitors. He knelt on the floor, keeping a respectful distance, and closed his eyes. "I am a poor, wayfaring stranger." The humming filled the room. The infant froze. Its tiny tympanic membranes fluttered wildly. It slowly turned its head, its crimson eyes locking onto the human. Nathaniel transitioned into the low, vibrating hum that he had learned from its mother. The infant took a hesitant step forward, its scythes clicking softly against the reinforced tile. It approached Nathaniel, tilting its head, and then, slowly, pressed its soft, vibrating snout against Nathaniel's knee. It let out a soft, matching hum. Nathaniel smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. He named the creature Aegis. 3 years passed. Outpost Delta 9 had fundamentally transformed. With UEMC's aggressive mining operations permanently halted by the UN, the outpost was converted into an advanced exozoology and deep crust research facility. Aegis grew rapidly. By his 3rd year, he stood 8 feet tall at the shoulder, a magnificent specimen of obsidian armor and calculated grace. Despite his terrifying appearance, his behavior entirely defied human expectations of an apex predator. He was deeply intelligent, profoundly curious, and fiercely loyal to Nathaniel. Aegis roamed the reinforced corridors of Level 4 freely. He learned to communicate using a complex system of acoustic clicks and hums, which Nathaniel and a team of acoustic engineers mapped to a rudimentary translation software. But Aegis's most striking trait was his empathy. He could sense human distress. When engineers were stressed or injured, Aegis would sit near them, emitting a low-frequency rumble that visibly lowered human heart rates and blood pressure. Humanity had not conquered the beast with fire. They had tamed him with compassion. It was the ultimate testament to the human spirit, our ability to pack bond with the universe, to find kinship in the darkest, most terrifying corners of the cosmos. But Kepler 186f was still a hostile world, and the deep crust held secrets far older and far more mindless than the Titanus sapiens. The disaster struck on a Tuesday, during a routine seismic recalibration. A massive tectonic shelf collapsed directly beneath Outpost Delta 9, tearing a jagged half-mile fissure through the bedrock. The outpost's alarms screamed to life, but it wasn't the structural damage that terrified Commander Reynolds. It was what came pouring out of the fissure. They were classified as lithophages, a subterranean swarm of parasitic, silicon-based arthropods. They were blind, mindless, and possessed an insatiable hunger for thermal energy. They looked like massive armored scorpions, moving in a continuous, roiling tidal wave of jagged legs and crushing mandibles. Within 20 minutes, the lower levels of the outpost were overrun. The automated plasma turrets overheated and melted down as the swarm threw millions of bodies at the defenses. The human personnel, numbering over 200, were forced into a desperate retreat toward the heavily armored primary loading bay, the very same room where Aegis's mother had died. Nathaniel ran alongside the retreating engineers, his lungs burning. Aegis kept pace beside him, his massive size defensively positioned, letting out warning clicks that echoed over the deafening roar of the swarm. "Seal the doors!" Reynolds screamed, as the last of the survivors stumbled into the loading bay. The heavy blast doors slammed shut, but the relief was short-lived. Almost immediately, the heavy durasteel doors began to buckle. The sheer kinetic force of millions of lithophages pressing against the metal caused the hinges to groan. The screeching of their mandibles grinding against the steel was deafening. "They're going to breach!" Captain Hayes shouted, raising his rifle. "We don't have the firepower to stop a swarm this size. We're dead!" Panic erupted in the loading bay. People wept, prayed, and braced for the inevitable. Aegis pushed his way to the center of the room. The massive beast stood tall, his crimson eyes glowing with intense brilliance. He turned to look at Nathaniel, his tympanic membranes fluttering rapidly. He let out a sequence of specific, high-frequency clicks. Nathaniel checked his wrist-mounted translator. The screen flashed. "Danger. Swarm armor kinetically resistant. Vulnerable to harmonic shatter. I will broadcast. You must amplify." Nathaniel's eyes went wide. He understood immediately. The lithophages had a silicon-based carapace. Like glass, it had a specific resonant frequency. If Aegis could hit the exact acoustic pitch and sustain it, the sheer vibrational force would shatter the swarm's armor. But Aegis alone couldn't produce enough acoustic power to penetrate the thick blast doors and reach the millions of parasites in the tunnels. "David!" Nathaniel screamed over the noise of the buckling doors. The outpost seismic broadcast array. We need to route the internal acoustic receivers directly to the deep crust transmitters. Are you insane? Reynolds yelled back. The array is designed to map the mantle, not broadcast sound. Do it! Nathaniel roared, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man with nothing left to lose. Aegis knows their frequency. He's going to break them. Reynolds sprinted to the auxiliary control terminal, frantically rerouting the base's communication power grid. Nathaniel pulled up his datapad, his fingers flying across the screen as he interfaced with the seismic array's output parameters. He needed to ensure the amplification didn't distort Aegis's pitch. He calculated the required acoustic power density to shatter the silicon lattice of the lithophages. To achieve the necessary stress threshold to fracture the silicon carapace, the acoustic intensity had to be immense. Nathaniel quickly calculated the necessary parameters to tune the outpost's amplifiers, focusing on the relationship between acoustic power, frequency, and the medium's density. He inputted the required resonant frequency conditions into the system's limiter bypass. I is gelijk aan frac 1 2 rho 5 2 p fifth 2 a 2 dollar, where $I is the acoustic intensity required to exceed the structural yield of the silicon armor. $rho is the density of the toxic atmosphere outside the bay. $V is the speed of sound in the methane mix. $F is the specific resonant frequency Aegis would produce, and $A is the displacement amplitude. He adjusted the array's subwoofers to ensure the wavelength matched the exact harmonic requirement. Lambda rakva. F resonant. I have the bypass, Nathaniel shouted. Reynolds, link the microphone feeds to the external seismic emitters. Maximum gain. Linked, Reynolds shouted, hitting the final execution key. Nathaniel looked at Aegis. Do it, buddy. Sing. Aegis planted his 6 heavy limbs onto the steel deck. He took a massive breath, his chest expanding, and threw his armored head back. It wasn't a roar. It was a note of pure, concentrated acoustic power. It was a sound so perfectly pitched, so incredibly dense, that it bypassed human hearing and vibrated directly in the marrow of their bones. The internal microphones caught the sound, feeding it into the base's massive seismic broadcast array. Outside the blast doors, the effect was apocalyptic. The amplified sound wave blasted down the subterranean tunnels. The resonant frequency hit the lithophage swarm with the force of a kinetic bombardment. The leading edge of the swarm instantly froze. For a split second, there was silence beneath the hum. Then, millions of silicon carapaces violently detonated. The sound of the lithophages shattering was like a glacier collapsing. The high-frequency resonance violently forced the crystalline structures of their armor to expand and contract until they simply pulverized into dust. Wave after wave of the parasitic swarm exploded into clouds of fine gray sand, their biological fluids vaporized by the sheer acoustic friction. Inside the loading bay, the blast doors stopped buckling. The terrifying screeching of the mandibles ceased. But the effort was taking a catastrophic toll on Aegis. Broadcasting at such a high intensity was rupturing his internal vocal sac. Thick, glowing blue blood began to spill from his jaws, hissing as it hit the floor. His massive legs trembled, the bioluminescence in his carapace flickering wildly. Aegis, stop! Nathaniel screamed, running toward the beast. They're dead! You did it! Stop! Aegis held the note for 3 more agonizing seconds, ensuring the swarm was entirely decimated. Then his vocal sac gave out with a wet tear. The massive beast collapsed to the steel floor, the impact shaking the room. Nathaniel threw himself to his knees, sliding into the familiar blue blood. He grabbed Aegis's heavy, armored head, cradling the beast's snout in his lap. Medical! Nathaniel shrieked, looking back at the stunned survivors. Get the trauma kits! Now! For a moment, nobody moved. The sheer impossibility of what had just happened paralyzed them. The vicious, terrifying monster of Sector 4 had just weaponized its own voice, destroying its own biology to save the humans who had murdered its mother. Move! Commander Reynolds bellowed, snapping out of his shock. Get the coagulants! Get the thermal blankets! You heard the man. Save that damn hero. Soldiers and engineers sprinted forward, abandoning their weapons, dropping to their knees beside the massive alien. They plunged human medical foam into alien wounds. They used industrial sealing torches to close the ruptured tympanic membranes. They worked with a frantic, desperate unity, covered in blue blood, fighting to keep the fading pulse alive. Nathaniel stayed by Aegis's head, his hands trembling as he stroked the smooth obsidian armor between the creature's dimming crimson eyes. Aegis let out a weak, ragged wheeze. He couldn't hum anymore, but he slowly leaned his heavy head into Nathaniel's chest, his eyes blinking slowly in the harsh light of the loading bay. Nathaniel leaned down, pressing his forehead against the beast's warm carapace. He closed his eyes and softly, gently, began to sing the lullaby. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home. Aegis's eyes remained open. The blue pulse in his veins stabilized. He wasn't weeping this time. He was resting. Humanity had stepped into the dark void of the cosmos, armed with guns and greed, expecting to find monsters. But in the cold depths of Kepler 186F, they learned their most vital lesson. The universe is a dangerous, unforgiving place. But humanity's greatest strength is not our capacity for destruction. It is our bizarre, beautiful, and boundless capacity for empathy. We are the species that will reach into the dark, find a dying monster, and sing it to sleep. And sometimes the monster wakes up and saves us in return. Did the incredible bond between Nathaniel and Aegis leave you speechless? Humanity's true superpower isn't our heavy weaponry, it's our boundless empathy and our willingness to protect the misunderstood. If this HFY tale of alien resonance and human compassion sent shivers down your spine, please hit that like button. Share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more epic, heart-pounding tales from the deepest corners of the galaxy.
Hi, my name is Tran Trong, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, a human sang a lullaby to the dying alien beast, and the vicious monster quietly wept. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, the strongest feeling was compassion. What began as a story about fear and danger slowly became something much more emotional, showing how kindness can reach places that strength and force never could. Moments like that are what make HV stories so memorable. One gentle lesson I took from this story is that empathy has a way of breaking down barriers. Even when two sides seem completely different, in everyday life, taking a moment to show understanding or kindness can change an interaction more than we expect. What part of the story affected you the most? And do you think the human understood the impact of that simple lullaby? Thank you for spending time with Palace Truths. If this story stayed with you after it ended, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and maybe like or subscribe for more H stories and sci-fi adventures.